Egypt, a place of magic and mystery, a place that captures the heart and imagination of those around the world. But many are asking, just who were those ancient Egyptians? If you picture ancient Egyptians looking like this, or like this, you would be right. In order to understand why, we must journey back in time to the original inhabitants of North Africa. Recent archaeological evidence coming from a 300,000-year-old skull argues what we know as humanity began here at the Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. It is now the earliest skull with characteristics suggestive of modern humans. Some dental and mandibular evidence point to a continuing lineage from Jebel to Assyrian all the way down to Ibero-Mauritian. Assyrian stone culture is known as being tanged or stemmed tools and started 150,000 years ago. They spread from Morocco all over North Africa. This would be a very important development, as they are widely regarded as being the first projectile tips found. Over time, an early split from the African lineages at 60,000 years appears to have interbred with Assyrians and stayed north to occupy Saharan Africa. Now, what about that ancient Egyptian DNA we were talking about? According to microblade technology, a new culture began to emerge around 24,000 years ago in North Africa. An archaeological site in Talfarat, Morocco, dated around 16,000 years, yielded DNA that has been modeled as 63.5 West Eurasian, 36.5 Sub-Sahara, or the most recent as 55% Zuzwana, an ancient people from the Caucasus mountain region of Georgia. They themselves consisting of 44% ancient Basal, Eurasian mixed with West European hunter-gatherer at 55%. They had spread from their homeland around 27,000 years ago and crossed with a new ancestral North African population, a people basal to all out-of-Africa migrants, which would complete the other 45% of their genome. The new culture found has been aptly named as Ibero-Mauritian. According to their skulls, they appear to be a Caucasian-looking people and were very large, around 6 foot tall on average for men. We have run some calculators, and their skin and hair genetics, which yielded some interesting results. Most had wavy to straight hair and intermediate skin. Quote, the TCHH1 gene codes for trichohyalin, a protein active in hair follicle roots. For all Tafarat individuals, we find the derived homozygous AA genotype for SNP-1 Tran76466946 in this gene, which has been associated with straighter hair in Europeans. These Ibero-Mauritians spread across North Africa, reaching Egypt, then the Levant, mixing with the local Levantines and creating one of the first cultures to harbor civilization. Known now as the Natufians, these were the people who built the walls of Jericho. They were also the creators of the first cereals and man's favorite, beer. To get an image of what these people may have looked like, we find that the southern Saudis and Yemenis hold the most Natufian-like ancestry at 75%. While this was going on in the North Saharan region, other developments were occurring concurrently in the south. Just nearby in Nubia, there was the Qaddan culture, dated 13,000–9,000 BCE. These people inhabited the region of North Sudan to southern Egypt, Wadi Halfa to Aswan on the Nile. Most scientific research argues that it is linked to West and East Africans, but also shifted towards Eastern Asian groups going by craniometric data. While primarily hunter-gatherers, they were also harvesting and eating wild grains, with lots of evidence of grinding stones. These people were also likely responsible for the 9,500-year-old solar alignment stone circles, famously known as Nabta Playa. Historian Christopher Ehret has stated he believes these people belong to the current to Nilo-Saharan language group. As we travel west through the Sahara, another culture appeared to be emerging in the desert sands. Evidence of cave paintings dating back to 10,000 show figurines of people and their stories. Starting with the Cave of Swimmers in Egypt, we find paintings of people swimming with giraffes and hippopotamuses nearby. What is now desert used to be green at certain points of history. The Sahara has been fluctuating from green to arid for thousands of years. It's likely the people who created the rock art originated near the mountainous region of Adrar Baous in Niger. According to anthropologist Sukopova, the rock art symbolizes many features of sub-Saharan African culture, including their masculine and feminine traits. But here's where things get interesting in the Caucasus Mountains region of Libya. The first evidence of mummifying the dead arises. A boy's organs were removed, as evidenced by incisions in his abdomen and thorax, and an organic preservative was inserted to stop his body from decomposing. The mummy of the child has been radiocarbon dated via the deepest coal layer where it was found to 7,438 and via the animal hide it was wrapped in to 5,405, which has been calibrated to 6,250 BP. This date precedes the earliest known ancient Egyptian mummies by 1,000 years. Other anthropological evidence around the site shows Afro-melanated people with some Mediterranean affinities, pointing to be a mixed population. Around 1,000 years after we find the first Egyptian mummy, it appears these cultures from the west, north and south converged in Upper Egypt around 4,500 BC and created the Badarian culture. When the Badarian skulls were examined by Egyptologists over the years, there has been some debate. Most anthropologists agree their skulls have both Negroid and Mediterranean affinities, however clustering most with other native North Africans. Evidence supporting this has become apparent in a recent study on the skulls of northern Nubia. The study ranged from the Mesolithic Kadan culture to the Nubian Sea Group culture. What became apparent was a clear change in skeletal morphology from the Mesolithic Kadan to the A culture group 3800 BC. This coincides with the coalescence of Afro-Astaic-speaking Mediterranean and Nilo-Saharan speaking peoples in Egypt. Comparisons with pre-dynastic Egyptian skulls and a group Nubians to Bronze Age Palestinians shows that the Egyptians and Nubians cluster closer together than either is to Palestine. Egyptologist Eret reported in 2023 that the earliest burials of pre-dynastic Upper Egypt show no indebtedness to the Levant, however share affinities with native Northeastern and Horn Africans. He also stated this indicates the Badarians were natives from this area of Africa going back millennia. There is indication that there is truth to the main Egyptian component coming from the native Ibero-Mauritians, 25,000 dated years, who had mixed with Natufian-like people 12,000 to 15,000 years ago in Egypt and created the Afro-Astaic languages, now known as Egyptian Amharic and Arabic among others. When we move to the Egyptian pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom period, we find men and women of olive, brown and black complexions on the artwork. As we look into genetics, we've previously had some mitochondrial DNA which passes down from the mother and Y paternal DNA which passes down from the father in areas of Sudan, Kenya and Egypt. However, we've never had DNA from the Egyptian Old Kingdom until now. We can start with the Sudan. We have autosomal DNA from the Christian period, 600 to 1000 AD. The Kulubnati Nubians had 43% Nilotic-related ancestry, individual variation between E36, 54%, with the remaining ancestry consistent with being introduced through Egypt and ultimately deriving from an ancestry pool like that found in the Bronze and Iron Age Levant. Next, the DNA of Middle Kingdom Lower Egyptian man Ankh, which we've had for some time now. We can see he has a high Natufian-like component, some Ibero-Maurusian and some African. Then we have Kenyan DNA, starting from the early pastoral Neolithic around 4000 BC. As we can see here, there is a large mix of East African and Levant-like admixture, more on that later. And now that brings us to the Old Kingdom sample from 2800 BC, Allele frequency-based analyses, PCA, admixture, F statistics, showed a strong genetic affinity of this sample to Levantine Natufians, quote. However, compared with genomes dated from the end of the dynastic period, Third Intermediate period, analyzed by Schunemann and present-day Egyptians, the Nuerat sample did not carry the Caucasus hunter-gatherer, CHG, genetic component that is widespread in present-day populations. According to the study author, the CHG component started to spread across West Asia 4,000 years ago. The Old Kingdom DNA is similar to the Natufian, but it is not identical, possibly older. Out of a number of samples, only one had enough undamaged DNA to test so. While the ancient DNA is mostly Natufian related, there are some affinities to East Africans. This is where the Kenyan DNA comes into play. In an ancient sample dated from the pastoral Neolithic, a Kenyan individual exhibited around 65 to 70% Natufian-related ancestry. The mix of Mota-like East Africans and Levantines appears to be the origin of the ancient Cushitics of Horn Africa. They were situated just southeast of Egypt and Sudan, near modern-day Eritrea and Ethiopia, where it became known as the Land of God, the legendary kingdom of Punt. Ancient Egyptians wrote and drew of their travels in the 12th dynasty epic Tales of the Shipwrecked Sailor. Anthropologist Wilson reports how the Egyptians arrived at Punt with jewelry, tools and weapons and returned with incense trees, ivory, myrrh and rare woods. When looking at ancient depictions of the Puntites, we find striking similarities to how the Egyptians illustrated themselves. What's more is it's likely one of the native inhabitants of Egypt, and Sudan the Beja came from the Cushitics, possibly Punt itself, at least since the 5th dynasty. Otherwise known as the famous Medjay, they were a warrior people, renowned for their militaristic skills. At one point they held administrative districts and held power in ancient Upper Egypt. Their range is from East Egypt Desert to the Red Sea and Eritrea, hint hint. It appears ancient Egyptians and Puntites shared many similarities when looking at ancient literature from the Greeks. They referred to them as a similar people. Quote, "They say also that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians." Furthermore, if we look at the ancient symbol for face in Egyptian, it resembles a sub-Saharan African. This may have something to do with the origin of pre-dynastic Egypt, lying more so in the southern part of Egypt, near where Nubians resided. It is important to note that although northern Sudan and southern Egypt were distinct cultures, they have been intrinsically linked since the pre-dynastic. The first nomes, administrative districts of Egypt, were in Tarseti, or the land of the bow. Nubians were well respected for their fighting ability, especially their archery. Many ended up becoming police and guards for Egyptian nobility. Egyptologist Frank Yurko stated that depictions of pharaonic iconography, such as the royal crowns, Horus falcons and victory scenes, were concentrated in the Upper Egyptian Naqada culture and A-group Nubia. The archaeologists are not sure which language A-group Nubians would have spoken. The candidates are a unique Nilo-Saharan, ancient Egyptian or another Afro-Asiatic language. Whatever they spoke, they were still apparently closely related to ancient Egyptians. However, the fact that their culture seems to disappear with the arrival of the Egyptian pre-dynastic, with only some migrant remnant being found further south near Kerma, shows they were distinct. They were then most likely absorbed by the Egyptians, and by that account intermediate genetically between Kerma Sudanese like Nilo-Saharan and Egyptian. According to all of these factors, it appears the first pharaonic people of ancient Egypt would have been a heavily admixed people. When doing this deep dive into ancient Egyptians, we find how many distinct cultures had moved around, traded, and combined. The fact that the DNA from Christian period Nubians shows 50-50 Nilotic and West Asian could further explain their background. We've added ancient DNA from a nearby distinct people, Kenyan pastoralists, and with Natufian coming in at 70%, we can get a picture of how Northeast Africa was the perfect mixing pot of people and culture. All in all, it appears the ancient Egyptians arose from a unity of ancient Ibero-Marusians migrating from the north, Nilo-Saharan people from the south, Natufians from east, and nomadic Neolithic from west, creating cultures near each other and then eventually crossing paths to boil the mixing pot that was ancient Egypt. Thanks for watching. Tell us what you think. Who were the ancient Egyptians? Like and subscribe.